now that we've read quite a lot of the swath of the biblical narrative, now that we have some kind of historical perspective, we're going to bring in the theological perspective, which in many ways will kind of circle back and bring into context all of the information that we have learned so far to develop a deeper understanding of theology. So this is your study sheet for today. We'll talk about ex nihilo. If you only vaguely remember what that means, we'll go back to it. We'll talk about the relationship between God and earth, between God and humanity, and between creation and humanity. This section comes almost directly from McGrath's book. We'll talk about anthropology. We'll talk about Aquinas and scholasticism. That might ring a bell from the historical unit when we were talking about the Protestant Reformation. We'll talk about creation and natural theology, which will bring us back to our discussion of Darwin. And then we'll talk about creation and creationism. So here's our roadmap for today. The big questions that we'll be thinking about today is, how do questions posed to the Bible shape the answers? And how do the texts we read shape our imagination and understanding of creation and anthropology? Also, why are we here and what is our destiny? So in the Bible, we have the preservation of the idea of creation ex nihilo, or creation out of nothing. We see this in Genesis 1. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. So there was nothing there. And then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was morning, and there was evening, the first day. This idea is also preserved elsewhere in the Bible, such as Job 38. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched a line upon it? Or on what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy?" So this portrays God laying the foundations of the earth from nothing. Psalm 95. "O come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to him with songs of praise. For the Lord is a great God, a great King above all gods. In his hand are the depths of the earth. The heights of the mountains are his also. The sea is his, for he made it, and the dry land which his hands have formed." So again, talking about God forming the dry land and the seas in Psalm 95. So in these cases, God brings order out of chaos and creation out of nothing, or creation ex nihilo. But there's also creation out of existing stuff presented in the Bible. We see this in Genesis 2. "In the day that the Lord made the earth and the heavens, when no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was no one to till the ground." So pause here for a second. There was already a ground. There was no rain. Then we continue. "But a stream would rise from the earth and water the whole face of the ground." So there was a stream that was existing when God created the world. "Then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east. There he put the man whom he had formed. Out of the ground the Lord God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of goodness and evil." And then we have a theologian named Justin Martyr. So I'm going to read Justin Martyr aloud. What did God create out of according to him? And how does he think humans, God, and faith interrelate? So I'll read it for you now. But we have received by tradition that God does not need the material offerings which men can give, seeing indeed that he himself is the provider of all things. And we have been taught that he in the beginning did of his goodness, for man's sake, create all things out of unformed matter. Ding, 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 ding. This is one place that you should look for answers to the question. For as in the beginning he created us when we were not, so do we consider that, in like manner, those who choose what is pleasing to him are, on account of their choice, deemed worthy of incorruption and of fellowship with him. For the coming into being at first was not in our own power, and in order that we might follow those things which please him, choosing them by means of rational faculties, he has himself endowed us with. He both persuades us and leads us to faith. And we think it for the advantage of all men that they are not restrained from learning these. So what did God create out of? Right before the ellipsis, which are those three periods, they look like three periods, it's called an ellipsis, unformed matter. So he created out of existing stuff. And then he just goes on to discuss that God has created us and given us rational faculties. And Justin Martyr thinks it's self-evident that these rational faculties will lead us to God. Granted, Justin Martyr was a product of his time, but his argument that by using reason we can arrive at an argument for God is an argument that has come into the fore at various times in human history, most notably during the Enlightenment with the development of natural theology. So natural theology didn't really begin with the Enlightenment, but rather we see seeds of it much, much earlier. Now we're moving to how God and creation relate. So McGrath's argument. First, he argues that God is distinct from creation. Second, he argues that God has authority over creation. Third, he argues for the goodness of creation. There is diversity in the theological community, however, about these claims about God. And as we've discussed throughout this class, part of what we're looking at is the diversity of beliefs that have existed alongside each other, both in Jewish and Christian communities across time and space. This continues even into the modern day. So another theologian named Jürgen Moltmann disagrees with McGrath. He says, in order to create a world outside himself, the infinite God must have made room beforehand for a finitude within himself. So we'll stop here for a minute. Notice McGrath argues that God is distinct from creation, but in Moltmann's cosmology, meaning how the world looks, he thinks of the world as God having made space for the world within God's self. So the world is actually a component of God's identity. It is only a withdrawal by God into himself that can free the space into which God can act creatively. The nihil for his creatio ex nihilo only comes into being because, and in as far as, the omnipotent and omnipresent God withdraws his presence and restricts his powers. So if God withdraws his presence and restricts his powers, what does that mean for authority? Now we'll bring in anthropology. I will put up a video that introduces the basics of anthropology, but more or less, anthropology studies the various cultures and people groups that have developed across time and space. And in many ways, modern anthropology seeks to preserve the distinction among people groups and cultures, but also to connect people groups and cultures in its efforts to develop a greater understanding about the diversity of the world. So anthropology, the word anthropos is the word for human in Greek. So anthropology is the study of humans. So we've talked about God and creation. We've introduced the basics of anthropology, the study of people groups across time and space. So God and humanity. The first question, why are humans here? What is our destiny? There have been various arguments about this across time and space. Thomas Aquinas, remember, he was an example of a scholastic theologian, meaning he uses dialectical reasoning to arrive at the best viewpoint. He argues that humans are divine image bearers. Aquinas argues if A, we'll say that's God, creates B, meaning humans. So A is God, B is humans. If God creates humans and A, meaning God, possesses quality Q, then humans will possess that same quality also. Much like the study of biology, where a child will bear some resemblance in some way, shape, or form to their biological forebears. So too, in Aquinas' ideology, because God created humanity in his belief, then humanity will possess some of the divine quality as well. So two of the distinctive qualities that theologians have frequently described as distinguishing humans from other species are intellect and reason. We'll get to that in a minute. So another thing that differentiates humans from other beings is potential for relationship with God, according to the view of theologians, and capacity to tell stories, and stories shape our identities. So now we come to the intellect and reasoning. I want you to take a quick break. If you haven't already watched these videos, I want you to watch the puppy videos. They're only a few minutes long, and honestly, they're really, really fun. So this smart little miniature husky finds a way to get on top of the counter. And my new BFFFF, Gaz, my best furry friend forever, has decided that he wants an indoor pool. Yeah, they're really fun videos. And they kind of challenge the idea that humans alone have capacity for intellect and reason and learning. So creation and humanity. So now we've kind of connected God and humanity and talked about some of the theories of that. Now we'll talk about creation and humanity. So Genesis 1:26 is on the left. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over all the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." Contrast this with Genesis 2:15. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and to keep it. So what is the difference between these two theologically? So on the one end, so the question around theology is, how do God and humans interrelate in these two verses from Genesis? You'll notice in the one on the left, humanity is expressly created in God's image. The one on the right, God creates the human, but the human is actually more connected with the other species of animals than with God. That doesn't mean that the human's necessarily disconnected from God, but rather there's a distinction. What about anthropologically? What's the role of humans in each of these portrayals? And ecologically, what's the difference between dominion? What does dominion make you think of? And what does tilling and keeping make you think of? What are the valences, a fancy word that means meanings? What are the meanings of these words? What do they make you think of? What connotations, positive, negative, or otherwise, do they have? Now, it must be said that these two aren't necessarily incompatible with one another, these two views, dominion and tilling and keeping, But it is important, at least from an academic perspective, to realize that the valence of these words is different. Dominion presupposes a sort of hierarchical existence in which humans are at the top, and the cattle and everything else exist for human use. Whereas the other one, tilling and keeping, suggests that the human is a partner in creation as opposed to standing at the top of some hierarchical pyramid. All right, so back to creation and creationism. There has been a movement to not teach evolution in schools in the modern day, and this stems in large part from the views of creation and creationism. Within various Christian communities, there are divergent responses to Genesis 1 and 2, as we alluded to in our first lecture on the biblical unit. So some people within Christian community ascribe to what's called young earth creationism, which suggests that the earth was created 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, according to Genesis 1 and 2. This tends to be in more conservative Christian communities. Mind you, conservative in this case means that they filter new information through tradition and experience, as opposed to reframing tradition and experience in the light of new information. What this means, though, is that people that ascribe to young earth creationism struggle to explain the carbon record, which suggests that the earth is much, much older than this. There's also the notion of old earth creationism, which is a response to the knowledge that the carbon record suggests that the earth is quite a lot older than that. In fact, billions of years old. So this argument within Christian community argues that the days were longer. There are quotes and there are verses in the Bible that say a day with you is like a day to you is like 1,000 years, or 1,000 years to you is like a day. Meaning that perhaps the earth was created in 6 very, very long days. Also within Christian community, there are notions of intelligent design. This is the suggestion that evolution occurs on a micro and potentially macro level, but it has a goal, meaning that it's aiming towards oneness with God. And then others within Christian community affirm theistic evolution, which suggests that God initiates evolutionary processes and the world was created to sustain itself. This goes back to Genesis 11 through 12, 20, and 24, where God tells the plants and the animals to bear seed, to kind of self-propagate, or to continue growing and changing. So you'll notice there's a wide diversity in the views of Christian community on creation, from affirmation of evolution to the belief that the earth is much, much younger than what the carbon record suggests. All right, we've covered a lot of ground with humans and God, creation, and creationism. Thank you for your attentiveness, and I will see you next lecture.